Here in America, and in many other countries, it is a weekly tradition to gather in the church pews on Sunday morning to fellowship on what is believed to be the Sabbath. And each week, Sunday services are advertised on large signs that grace the front lawns of many churches, and no one questions the seemingly universal acceptance of a day of worship that is not in line with any of the commandments found in Scripture. Still others gather in churches to worship on the seventh day, such as Seventh-day Adventists, Seventh-day Baptists, and members of Church of God Seventh Day. But they mark their Sabbath from the evening of Friday to the evening of Saturday, in a 24-hour span that is in keeping with the tradition of the Khazarian Jews. This practice, as you will see, is also not based on Scripture. And still others are using the phases of the moon to determine their Sabbath, which causes their Sabbath to land on days other than the seventh day of the week at times. But we'll also address this false concept. Now, one might ask, or they should at any rate, how did it come to this?
AD 306, a new Roman emperor came into power, and things began to rapidly change. Constantine the Great was a capable military leader and a shrewd politician.
So Constantine had to fight a series of civil wars in order to achieve his political aim of becoming emperor. And that's his own personal and political aim. It's got nothing to do with Christianity. He goes down from Gaul, modern-day France, where his power base was, to confront his rival Maxentius in Italy.
Constantine moves down from the north. And you think of Italy, there's this long stretch. And he wins one battle after another.
As he was marching with his army, he had a dream one night where God came to him and told him, "You will become a Christian and put this sign on your shield, and you will conquer." Shortly after that, he actually had a vision, which history tells us was seen by his army as well as by Constantine himself.
He looked up to the sun, and he saw a cross of light above it, and the Greek words, "en tutu Nikeia," by this conquer.
In the Roman Empire, Jews are an old religion, and old religions are respected. When the Jews kept fighting against Rome, what had been kind of an umbrella of safety under Judaism becomes a lightning rod to Christianity.
The Christians become alienated from the Jews. Jews persecuted them, and so they're trying to distance themselves from the Jews.
Church leaders began to devalue the seventh-day Sabbath of the Ten Commandments in preference for the more popular Roman Sunday.
Some Christians mistakenly thought that you should fast on the Sabbath, but you could feast on Sunday. That's what the pagans did. They feasted on Sunday, fasted on Saturday. Not a Jewish concept. The Jews fasted Friday and feasted Sabbath. But that's how some Christians thought of it. So if you're fasting on one day and you're feasting on the next, you can guess which day becomes the more popular day. There's a third reason, and that is the influence of sun worship that creeps into the church. And when sun worship begins to creep into the church, Constantine can make use of that to lead to the exaltation of Sunday, the day of the sun, as being the day that people should worship on.
This gradual departure from God's law over the centuries has become so widely accepted that most are shocked to learn that Sunday keeping has no foundation in the Bible. In AD 313, Constantine published the Edict of Milan, establishing Sunday as a day of rest. The emperor's Sunday law had nothing to do with Christianity. It was actually to honor the main Greco-Roman sun god called Helios, or Apollo.
The Emperor Constantine became a convert to Christianity, and also because he remained partial to the sun god, the Emperor Constantine moved the day of worship from Saturday, the Sabbath, as had been traditional in Judaism, obviously, to Sunday, the day of the sun god. And ever since, Christian folks, at least for the most part, overwhelmingly, have held their day of worship on Sunday rather than Saturday.
This is clear from another edict of Constantine given in AD 321, when the emperor ordered,
"On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed."
Notice, the edict uses the word sun, S-U-N. It's also recorded that Constantine the Great made a law for the whole empire that Sunday should be kept as a day of rest. Obviously, this change did not infiltrate the church overnight. History tells us that for decades, the seventh-day Sabbath, together with Sunday, were both observed as holy days.
The very, very early church clearly is still worshipping on the Jewish Saturday in the times of the apostles. But by the mid to late 3rd century, that has largely been abandoned or is in the process of being abandoned. By the early 4th century, in many parts of the Roman world, Christians are generally worshipping on Sunday.
A lot of Christians during this period of time would observe the Sabbath, and then on Sunday they would have a service remembering the resurrection, and then they'd go about their regular work. It's during the time of Constantine in which the idea of transferring the solemnity of the Sabbath to Sunday is first expressed.
Centuries earlier, the prophet Daniel had foretold a religious power would arise that would think to change times and laws. Within the Ten Commandments, there's only one law that is also a time: the Sabbath.
Many Christians will argue that the basis for observing Sunday is found in Scripture, and they'll even argue that it does not replace the seventh-day Sabbath, but we have clearly seen that Sunday was meant to replace it. Meanwhile, there is no command found anywhere in Scripture that informs us of the seventh day being replaced as a day to be set aside for rest. One thing you have to realize is that the worship of deities was of chief importance to the decision makers of the ancient world, and many of their decisions have persisted to this day. The many gods they served have crept into Christianity, science, and even mundane issues we take for granted, such as the names of the days of the week and the names of months, among other things. As to the names of the days of the week,
when you take a closer look at the words which make up our days of the week, we soon realise that they come from a very specific time and place. The Saxons and the Vikings contributed to what we call the days of the week. In other words, our words for the days of the week are more than 1,000 years old. So, Monday does not in fact come from Monday. Instead, its roots are in Old English, specifically Monundag. And what does Monundag mean? Well, it means the moon's day. Monday, therefore, or Moon Day, was a day dedicated to the moon. This is not because it was a dark day, but rather for the early Saxons and for the Vikings, the sun and the moon were personified in godlike figures. Mani, the moon, and Sol, his sister, the sun. This day also offered a chance to contemplate the changing moon throughout the month. The next day of the week is, of course, Tuesday, and this day also has its roots in Old English, specifically Tuesdag. For the early Saxons and the Vikings, Tuesdag was in fact Tyr's Day. Tyr figured prominently in Norse mythology. He was son of Odin, god of war, a brave god. When the gods needed to bind the massive wolf Fenrir, it was Tyr who offered his arm as forfeit. The wolf was bound, and Fenrir took the arm. A brave god indeed. So, do we have any ideas where Wednesday or Wednesday may come from? Well, it comes from the Old English Wodnesdag. Woden was one of the names for the king of the gods. This was Odin's day. Sat in the middle of the week, one could hardly avoid the day of Odin, the king of the gods, the one-eyed wise man, with 2 pet ravens, one for thought and one for memory. This meant he knew everything. Now, surely Thursday is an easy one to guess. Thursday, Well, in Old English, Thursday was Thunrusdag. Any ideas? Yes, that's right, we're talking about Thor's Day. Thor is probably the most famous of the Norse and Germanic gods. He was a god of lightning and power and wielded a small if effective hammer called Mjolnir. Here he is, twisting his beard into the shape of his hammer. Thor was popular, charismatic, sometimes very stupid, but always very brave. Next we come to Friday. Going on the pattern, whose day might Friday be? Well, the Old English is Frigadag. Well, this quite simply means Frigg's Day. Frigg, sometimes known as Frigga, was the wife of Odin, queen of Asgard, and mother to a very popular god, Balder. In Old English, Frigg is a byword for a beloved lady, and together with Odin they ruled over all the gods. She is also thought to have been able to weave with clouds. Next, of course, we come to Saturday. Saturday was known as Sunnanefn. This quite literally meant the eve of Sunday, or Sunday's eve. However, eventually Old English did adopt another name, that being Saturnsdag. What could this be? Well, it's very similar to Saturday, and it comes from a completely different collection of gods. Yes, that's right, you got it, it's Saturn, the god of agriculture and a good harvest. He was also the father of the Roman king of the gods, Jupiter. Now, in Old English, Sunday was known as Sunnandag. Any ideas whose day this might be? Well, hopefully you figured out it was the sun's day, preceding the moon's day, Monday. This was a day dedicated to the sun and the crucial role the sun plays in daily life. Together, the sun and her brother the moon ran through the sky, pursued by wolves. So, when examining your shiny new calendar, bear in mind that the days of the week in English and some other languages largely owe their names to the pantheon of Germanic and Norse gods.
It is clear to see why Sunday was chosen as the new sanctified day of the week, replacing the day that Yah had blessed in the garden according to Genesis chapter 2 verse 3. And Elohim blessed the seventh day and declared it pure, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. But, as stated, that day was replaced because the adversary, Satan, the devil, did say, "I will climb to the highest heavens and be like the Most High." Being like the Most High, for one thing, means having one's own day of worship. Hence the elevation of Sunday to the highest day of the week is observed by most Christians today. This was prophesied in the book of Daniel. There we read of a beast power, none other than Rome, which would give rise to a succession of rulers of whom it is said, "He will defy the Most High and oppress the pure people of the Most High. He will try to change times and laws." He will try to change times and laws. Times refer to calendar movements, and by taking a quick glance at the present-day Gregorian calendar, we can see that something is off. The year begins in winter, but Yah set the beginning of the year in spring. On this day in early spring, in the month of Abib, you have been set free. How do we know that the spring month of Abib is the first month of the year? Well, we are told, "Then the whole community of Israel set out from Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin, between Elim and Mount Sinai. There they arrived on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt." So Yah declared Abib, which is in spring, as the first month of the year, but the Romans appointed January, which is in winter, as the first month. But history tells us that the month of March once marked the beginning of a 10-month year. In the Book of Festivals and Ceremonies of the Roman Republic by H. Scullard, we read, "The vexed problems of its early history do not concern us here, except to note that the early changeover from a 10-month to a 12-month year left this mark in the names of the months. The 10-month year started in March." It is clear to see what he means by examining the names of the months. September, for instance, comes from the Latin word septem, which means 7, and October comes from the Latin word octo, as in octopus or octagon. This is obviously 8. November comes from novem, Latin for 9, and December comes from Latin decem, referring to 10, such as in the decimal point or comma, which deals in the change of number values from negative to positive powers of 10. But instead of being the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months, as they once were, they are now the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months, because the addition of the months of January and February to the Roman calendar year pushed them back. While this calendar incident is just one attempted change to times, we'll digress. It is written that the rulers within this beast power would think to change laws also, and the Sabbath, which is one such important law according to Exodus 20, was and is to be observed on the 7th, not the first day of the week. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it pure. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to Yah your Elohim. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. Now we have already seen that Constantine enforced an edict to venerate the first day of the week instead of the 7th day as appointed by Yah. But the 4th century leaders of the Catholic Church felt it necessary to further enforce the power and importance of the first day of the week in the famed Council of Laodicea.
From the Apostles' time until the Council of Laodicea, which was about the year 364, the holy observation of the Jews' Sabbath continued, as may be proved out of many authors, yea, notwithstanding the decree of the Council against it.
The Council stipulated as follows: Christians shall not Judaize and be idle on Saturday, for they shall work on that day, but the Lord's day they shall especially honor, and as being Christians, shall if possible do no work on that day. If, however, they are found Judaizing, they shall be shut out from Christ. Why did they feel the need to do this? Well, despite the earlier edict of Constantine, many still held to the authoritative word of Scripture, seeing the clear law of Yah of more importance than that of Rome. In the second volume of the Antiquities of the Christian Church we read,
The ancient Christians were very careful in the observation of Saturday or the 7th day. It is plain that all the Oriental churches in the greatest part of the world observe the Sabbath as a festival. Athanasius likewise tells us that they held religious assemblies on the Sabbath, not because they were infected with Judaism, but to worship Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath.
Epiphanius says the same. Even after this time period, we'll see that the observance of a 7th-day Sabbath permeated the believing world, despite the decree of the Council of Laodicea. In fact, there was never a time in history where the Romans succeeded in swaying every believer to follow their corrupt customs. What follows are just a few surviving accounts of 7th-day Sabbath observance by past believers throughout the centuries.
5th century, Constantinople. The people of Constantinople and almost everywhere assembled together on the Sabbath, as well as on the first day of the week, which custom is never observed at Rome or at Alexandria. 6th century, Rome. About 590, Pope Gregory, in a letter to the Roman people, denounced as the prophets of Antichrist those who maintain that work ought not to be done on the 7th day. 7th century, Scotland and Ireland. It seems to have been customary in the Celtic churches of early times, in Ireland as well as Scotland, to keep Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, as a day of rest from labor. They obeyed the 4th commandment literally upon the 7th day of the week. 8th century, India, China, Persia. Widespread and enduring was the observance of the 7th-day Sabbath among the believers of the Church of the East and the St. Thomas Christians of India, who never were connected with Rome. It also was maintained among those bodies which broke off from Rome after the Council of Chalcedon, namely the Abyssinians, the Jacobites, the Maronites, and the Armenians. 10th century, Church of the East, Kurdistan. The Nestorians eat no pork and keep the Sabbath. They believe in neither auricular confession nor purgatory. 11th century, Scotland. They held that Saturday was properly the Sabbath on which they abstained from work. 12th century, Wales. There is much evidence that the Sabbath prevailed in Wales universally until AD 1115, when the first Roman bishop was seated at St. David's. The old Welsh Sabbath-keeping churches did not even then altogether bow the knee to Rome, but fled to their hiding places. 15th century, Norway. We are informed that some people in the different districts of the kingdom have adopted and observed Saturday keeping. It is severely forbidden in Holy Church canon, one and all to observe days excepting those which the Holy Pope, Archbishop, or the bishops command. Saturday keeping must under no circumstances be permitted hereafter further than the Church canon commands. Therefore, we counsel all the friends of God throughout all Norway who want to be obedient towards the Holy Church to let this evil of Saturday keeping alone, and the rest we forbid under penalty of severe church punishment to keep Saturday holy. 16th century Council of Trent. On the 18th of January, 1563, the Council of Trent ruled that tradition is greater than Scripture, after a powerful speech by the Archbishop of Reggio, in which he said that the fact that the Church had changed the fourth commandment clearly proved that tradition was greater than Scripture.
19th century to the present. The following is a quote from a Catholic magazine, The Catholic Mirror, published in Baltimore, Maryland, September 1893. The Catholic Church, for over 1,000 years before the existence of a Protestant, by virtue of her divine mission, changed the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday. In the Old Testament, reference is made 126 times to the Sabbath, and of all texts conspire harmoniously in voicing the will of God, commanding the seventh day to be kept, because God himself first kept it, making it obligatory on all as a perpetual covenant. Examining the New Testament from cover to cover critically, we find the Sabbath referred to 61 times. We find, too, that the Savior invariably selected the Sabbath, Saturday, to teach in the synagogues and work miracles. The four Gospels refer to the Sabbath, Saturday, 51 times. Hence the conclusion is inevitable, that of those who follow the Bible as their guide, the Israelites and the Seventh-day Adventists have the exclusive weight of evidence on their side, whilst the biblical Protestant has not a word in self-defense for his substitution of Sunday for Saturday. They have ignored and condemned their teacher, the Bible, and they have adopted a day instituted and kept by the Catholic Church. There are many more examples of defiance against Rome by way of Sabbath keeping, but time and space does not allow us to share those instances here. You are free to look them up on your own, however. What the proceeding does show is that in every generation, Yah always has a small remnant fanning the flames of truth. The same is true today, as there is currently a remnant among us who is fully awake and aware of the truth, and more are waking up each day. Now, while the Sabbath has been observed throughout the centuries despite the efforts of Rome, that day has not been kept in the manner in which it was first instituted, and the reason for that lies in the various captivities the children of Israel endured at the hands of their enemies due to their rebellion against Yah. And what you will notice is that after each captivity, starting with Egypt, Israel always came away with the practices and customs of the nation that held it captive. Israel identified with the Egyptians and desired to go back to that land many times following the Exodus. And after leaving Babylon, the name of the Babylonian deity Tammuz was adopted to replace the name of the fourth month on the Hebrew calendar. But that is not all we adopted from the Babylonians, as you will soon see. So, where did the 24-hour day come from? And is it scriptural? On page 168 of The Sage Age, by Ma'ana Stevenson, we read, ancient Middle Eastern cultures had also developed precise solar calendars which required them to divide the day into equal periods of specific lengths. By 3000 BC, the Sumerians had divided the day into 12 periods, each with 30 sub-periods. Similarly, around 2000 BC, the Babylonians developed the 24-hour day divided into 60 minutes, which was divided into 60 seconds. This is the division adopted by the Western world. And on page 6 of the History of Time, a very short introduction, we read that the Babylonians invented a 24-hour day, the beginning of which they marked at sunset. So, if the Babylonians invented a 24-hour day, which they marked from sunset to sunset, and which the world adopted in some way, shape, or form, how did the ancient Hebrews observe the Sabbath in Scripture? One might argue that It does not matter when the Sabbath begins or ends. And at first glance, it does seem like a trivial or minor detail. But Scripture proves that all of Yah's laws, including the Sabbath, are binding obligations upon his people. And Yeshua himself, our Messiah, said in Matthew 3, verse 15, that we must carry out all that Elohim requires. Or, in other words, it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. And in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32, we read, "So be careful to obey all the commands I give you. You must not add anything to them or subtract anything from them." Okay, now that we've got that straight, let's see what constitutes a day in Scripture. Be warned that this next segment may be a complete departure from what some of you have understood about the Sabbath for years, but bear with me, as the Scriptures are quite clear on the subject. First, let's go to Exodus chapter 16. There we find details surrounding manna and how it was to be gathered. Verses 21 and 22 tell us how often it was to be gathered. "And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating. And when the sun grew hot, it melted. And it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for 1 man. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses." Why did they gather twice as much on the 6th day? Well, verse 26 tells us, "6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none." When we focus on verses 23 to 25, we see how the day was actually marked at that time. "And he said unto them, This is that which Yah has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the pure Sabbath unto Yah. Bake that which you will bake today, and boil that which you will boil. And that which remains over lay up for you to be kept until the morning." And they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade. And it did not stink, neither was there any worm in it. And Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto Yah. Today you shall not find it in the field." Did you notice that tomorrow was not considered the evening of the previous day? Tomorrow meant morning, or when the sun arose. You'll see this time after time in Scripture. The example of the manna is also clear. From the verses we just covered, we see that the manna that was not used on the 6th day did not spoil by the morning of the Sabbath, but they used it on that day. Whereas on days other than the Sabbath, according to verses 19 and 20, whatever was left over spoiled by the next morning. And Moses said, "Let no man leave any of it till the morning." But they hearkened not unto Moses. But some of them left some of it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Why did this happen in the morning? Because morning marked the beginning of a new day, and not evening. We see the same example in Leviticus chapter 7. In verse 15 we read, "And the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving shall be eaten the same day that it is offered. He shall not leave any of it until the morning." We clearly see here that the morning begins a new day, for the peace offerings were to be eaten the same day, which included evening. Nothing was to be left till the next day, which is described as morning. If the day began in the evening, this verse would read, "He shall not leave any of it until the evening." Simple and plain. Now, many of these scriptures we're addressing here have been read and reread by people over and over again. But because of the long-held traditions of the 24-hour day, which the world accepts, and evening-to-evening Sabbaths, which the Khazarian Jews hold to, as well as many Sabbath-keeping churches and Hebrew Israelite believers, the simple truth in these verses is overlooked. They clearly point to a 12-hour day that begins in the morning. The next verse we'll address is found in 1 Samuel chapter 19. This one is extremely obvious. In verse 11 we read, "Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him, and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If you save not your life tonight, tomorrow you shall be slain." Clearly, tomorrow is viewed as in the morning. This is painfully obvious. The terms tonight and tomorrow are even distinguished as separate in the text. Now let's look at the book of Jonah. In chapter 4, verse 7, we read, "But Elohim prepared a worm when the morning rose the next day." and it attacked the plant so that it withered. In truth, I have yet to find a verse in Scripture that clearly says that the evening marked the beginning of a day. This is a Babylonian concept and nothing more. Instead of Scripture verses stating that evening begins a day, we find that evening is just part of the same day that began in the morning, period. That example is in the book of Mark, chapter 4. In verse 35 we read, "And the same day, when the evening was come, he said unto them, Let us pass over onto the other side." You see, when I isolate the portion of text that refers to how a day was reckoned, it is clear to see what constituted a day in Scripture and what marked the beginning of a day. But those points get lost when you're absorbed in the narrative while reading. This is because our brains are switched off to these simple truths due to the accepted tradition of what are known as Babylonian hours. The 24-hour evening to evening day, or in the case of the world, a midnight to midnight 24-hour day. But Yeshua, in the book of John, chapter 11, verse 9, said this, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walks in a day, he stumbles not, because he sees the light of this world." Babylonian concepts need to be forgotten. We need to practice what the Scripture clearly teaches. Now, let's tackle the Day of Atonement, because the particulars of this fast have been used time and again to justify an evening to evening Sabbath. But let's get a clear understanding of what is said about it. The first thing we have to note is that there are 2 days mentioned for the observation of this day, and not one. 2 days, remember. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 23. In verse 27 we read, "Also on the 10th day of the 7th month there shall be a day of atonement. It shall be a pure convocation unto you, and you shall humble yourselves and offer an offering made by fire unto Yah." Here we learn that the Day of Atonement is to be observed on the 10th day of the 7th month. That is clear. Now down in verse 32 we read something very interesting. "It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall humble yourselves. In the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening unto evening shall you celebrate your Sabbath." Bear in mind that this is specifically referring to the Day of Atonement and not all Sabbaths. In fact, Moses had to spell this out in detail, making reference to the 9th day and the 10th day, because it was not customary to celebrate a Sabbath in this manner. Let's take a look at a few verses that speak of Sabbath observance in Yeshua's day. First, there's Matthew chapter 27. Verse 62 says, "Now the next day, that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate." While regular Sabbaths or feast days do not begin in the evening like the Day of Atonement, weekly Sabbaths did have a preparation day, which was the 6th day of the week. This allowed people to get ready for the Sabbath where no work could be done. Mark 15 highlights this point. In verse 42 we read, "And now when the evening was come," because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. You see, evening did not mark the start of the day. Mark 15:42 clearly says that evening had come, but it wasn't Sabbath as yet. Though it was evening, it was still the day before the Sabbath. As to the 6th day being the preparation day, we see that even Joseph of Arimathea acted according to the law. "When the evening was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Yeshua's disciple. He went to Pilate and begged for the body of Yeshua. Then Pilate commanded the body to be delivered." Why did he ask for Yeshua's body when evening had come? The book of the law reveals the answer. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, we read, "And if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is to be put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day." Note that the command states, "You shall bury him that day," again showing that evening is tied to the day that begins in the morning. Even the accounts of Yeshua's death clearly state that between the 6th hour and the 9th hour the sky was darkened, and we know this to be somewhere around noon and 3 p.m. That's a major clue right there. If 11 a.m. to noon was reckoned as a 6th hour, when did the count begin? That's right, at first light, in the morning, when the day truly began. There is so much more that could be said on this subject, but I'm sure you get the point. You can do further digging on your own and you'll see more truth with regard to the day's true length, as there are many more scripture verses that bear this out. Now, as to the lunar Sabbath issue I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I won't labor on this point too much, as others have done a fine job of debunking that idea already. I will add this point, however. When looking at Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 to 5, we see that light or day was created on day 1, but the sun, moon, and stars weren't created until day 4. According to the lunar Sabbath theory, the new moon or new month determines when the Sabbath will fall, so it fluctuates from day to day, falling sometimes on a 6th day of the week, a 5th day of the week, etc. But it always lands at the same time of the lunar month. The problem with this, and there are several problems really, is that we are commanded to keep the 7th day of the week as a Sabbath. See Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. And it was first kept way back at creation on the 7th day, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. The moon could not have determined the first Sabbath because the first Sabbath came a mere 3 days after the moon was created. The weekly Sabbath was therefore instituted as a weekly event on week 1. Now, some believe that the week of creation refers to a 6 or 7,000 year period because of Psalm 90 verse 4 and 2 Peter 3 verse 8, where it states that with Yah, 1,000 years is like a day. There is one huge hole in that theory as well, and it is also found in Genesis. The key to correcting this misconception is found in Genesis chapter 5 verse 5. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years. And he died. Adam was 930 years old when he died. If the world were created in 6,000 years, the 6th day, when Adam was created, would have spanned 1,000 years in and of itself. And Adam would easily have been more than 2,000 years old, counting the supposed 1,000-year Sabbath he lived through. At the end of the day, all these false notions fall flat when weighed against Yah's pure word of truth. The importance of the Sabbath cannot be stressed enough. For one thing, it was etched into the tablets as part of the covenant laws we agreed to as Israel. And Yah said unto Moses, cut out 2 tables of stone like unto the first, and I will write upon these tables the words that were in the first tables, which you broke. And he cut out 2 tables of stone like unto the first. And Moses rose up early in the morning and went up unto Mount Sinai, as Yah had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. And he was there with Yah 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water, and he wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. As I stated earlier, the Sabbath started in the garden during creation week, and Yah himself kept it. And on the 7th day Elohim ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And Elohim blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all his work which Elohim created and made. It is the sign or marker that identifies him as the creator of all things. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days Yah made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. And the final point is, all of this still stands because according to Scripture, for I am Yah, I change not. Therefore you sons of Jacob are not consumed. My hope is that this presentation has aided you and brought a greater degree of understanding concerning the Sabbath. May Yah continue to give you light in this regard and strengthen you on your walk. And I leave you with these words from the book of Isaiah. Keep the Sabbath pure. Don't pursue your own interests on that day, but enjoy the Sabbath and speak of it with delight as Yah's pure day. Honor the Sabbath in everything you do on that day, and don't follow your own desires or talk idly. Then Yah will be your delight. I will give you great honor and satisfy you with the inheritance I promised to your ancestor Jacob. I, Yah, have spoken.